Welcome to Biology 160, Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. This is the lecture series on the lymphatic system. When it comes to systems in the body, this is probably the one that you'd think of last of all, if you think of it at all. So as you're naming off the different systems, this isn't one that comes readily to mind, but it is a very important system. It's kind of the guys in the background that keep everything running smoothly. So they're the backstage help. Without the lymphatic system, we'd have a lot of problems. In fact, when something happens with the lymphatic system, we notice immediately, and it can cause a lot of problems. But when it's running normally, we don't really give it a lot of thanks. So let's talk about this interesting system. It's made up of two parts that work together to make this system work. First of all, we have what are called the lymphatic vessels, and their job is to bring all the fluid back into the cardiovascular system. So the lymphatic system in this way is connected very closely with the cardiovascular system. In the last lecture we talked about how as the cardiovascular system is sending the blood and the plasma around the body, plasma is leaking out into what we call the interstitial fluid around the cells. And that's what it's supposed to do. It's a normal thing. The blood cells don't move out, but the fluid and the nutrients can. And then the cells are able to pull what they need from that fluid. But over time, if this fluid just kept on draining out, eventually that would build up, and we'd be these little swollen masses of people walking around. But that's where the lymphatic system comes in. Its job is to pick up that excess fluid and take it back to the cardiovascular system and dump it back in. And so that's one of its major jobs. Then the second thing we have are the lymphoid tissues and the organs. And these guys are our defense system, our body's defense system. And you can see how this part of the lymphatic system connects with this function, which is body defense and keeping us safe from all the foreign substances that are trying to attack our body. So our body's under constant attack. And again, a lot of times we don't even realize that, but if something happens with our immune system, which does happen in a number of diseases, and specifically the very debilitating disease, very scary disease, AIDS, there's the HIV virus you may be familiar with, and we may take some time to talk about it in this lecture, we'll see. But the HIV virus, what it does is it attacks the cells of our immune system, and you don't die from having the HIV virus, you die from what we call AIDS, which is the disease. And it's the immunodeficiency syndrome. And so as your immune system shuts down, those people that have AIDS become very vulnerable to other diseases, and they often die from things like the common cold or the flu, or things that wouldn't necessarily affect a healthy person. But because their immune system has been compromised, suddenly they're not able to fight back in these foreign substances that are always attacking our body. So as you can see, the lymphatic system has some very important functions. And so through this lecture, we're going to look at those functions and what they do. Let's start by talking a little bit about what lymph is. Lymph is the fluid that is carried in the lymphatic vessels, basically. And lymph is an interesting type of fluid because it is very similar to the other types of fluid that we've talked about in the cardiovascular system and the interstitial fluid. It's called lymph because it's flowing in the lymphatic vessels. So in the cardiovascular system, we've talked about plasma, and this is the fluid that the blood cells are flowing in. So our blood is mostly made up of plasma, which is mostly made up of water, but there's some other things that are located in there. The plasma drains out of the capillaries and moves into the interstitial space. And at that point, we call it interstitial fluid. And this interstitial fluid is the fluid that all of our cells are bathed in. And it's made up of very similar things that the plasma is made of because it comes from the plasma. And then this interstitial fluid around our cells will then flow into the lymph nodes, and then suddenly we call it lymph. And so in composition, It's very similar to interstitial fluid and plasma, but we call it lymph because of where it's located, and it's traveling through the lymphatic system back into the cardiovascular system, which then it'll become part of the plasma again. And that's so the lymphatic vessels, one of the main things they carry is this fluid, but different than the capillaries, different than the cardiovascular system, there's some other things that can get into the lymph system as well, lymphatic system as well. So if you remember back to when we talked about the capillaries are relatively leaky cells. Their job is to allow nutrients, allow fluid to move out of the capillaries into the interstitial space so that that is available to the cells. However, the capillaries are not so leaky that cells can get out. You don't have bacteria and things like that getting out of the cardiovascular system, leaking out of these capillaries, cancer cells and things like that. Lymphatic system, on the other hand, the capillaries of the lymphatic system are so leaky that even cells, cancer cells, debris, besides the fluid, all these other things can flow into the lymphatic system, lymphatic vessels as well. So cancer cells can flow in here, bacteria, and that's okay because one of the jobs of the lymphatic system is the immune system. And so even though the cancer cells can sometimes use the lymphatic vessels to get around the body, at the same time our body is using the lymphatic vesicles in order to try to get rid of the cancer, try to get rid of the bacteria, the viruses and things, the dead cells that are floating around, the debris and things like that, to clean up the system. So this is kind of our janitorial service of our body. You can see in this picture here that the lymphatic vesicles are made up of these somewhat flap-like cells that form a way for the fluid to move in. So what we have here is we have these filaments, connective tissue, filaments that are attached, that are holding these cells in place, these very loose-fitting cells. But on the other side here, this is like a little flap, a little door. So it's the hinges are here, and then as the fluid is coming in, this is going to swing open like this, and then the fluid's going to be able to move into the lymphatic system. However, it is a one-way valve. If the pressure is higher out here than in here, then the fluid will move in. But if the pressure starts to build in here, that's going to force these valves shut so that the fluid can't leak back out. So this is a one-way trip. And so this allows the fluid to always be moving back towards the cardiovascular system. So let's go back to this slide here and talk a little bit more about the properties of the lymphatic system. As I just mentioned, this is a one-way system. Remember, the cardiovascular system is not a one-way. It's a circular pathway. So it goes and comes back to the heart, always moving in a circular pathway. The lymphatic system, on the other hand, is a one-way trip. So if you look here, this compares the cardiovascular system to the lymphatic system. So the blood, as it's moving through the arteries, it's making this trip around the body, whereas the lymphatic system is only moving back towards the body. But the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system do come in contact with each other, and this happens at capillary beds. So as the blood is moving through the cardiovascular system, coming to these capillary beds and back into the venules, this fluid is leaking out of these capillaries, and then intermixed among these capillaries of the cardiovascular system, we have the lymphatic system capillaries, and they're picking up that excess fluid that's leaking out of the capillaries and then taking it back towards the cardiovascular system. There is no pump in the lymphatic system. The cardiovascular system has a pump, the heart, which is pushing that blood away from the heart, and in some ways, though, it is like the cardiovascular system because on the venule side only. So in the cardiovascular system, the pump, the heart, is pushing that blood through the arteries, the arterioles, into the capillaries. By the time you get through the capillaries, though, all the pressure is gone. And then as you're moving back towards the heart and the veins and the venules, there's basically no pressure. And so that's the same thing with the lymphatic system. It's headed back towards the heart, just like the veins, and there's no pump moving it there. And so the way the lymph moves towards the heart is very similar to the ways that the veins return the blood to the heart as well. And so the way this happens is with the milking action of skeletal muscles. So as we move our muscles, this causes the muscles to squeeze the lymphatic vessels and push the fluids back towards the cardiovascular system. And then in some of the larger lymphatic vesicles, we have some smooth muscle that will contract. And again, this is similar to the veins, that we have these rhythmic contractions to help continue moving that fluid. So we always want to keep the fluid moving back to where it needs to go. If that fluid gets backed up, no new fluid is able to enter the lymphatic system, and that leads to problems like edema, which is swelling of the body. And then also, the lymphatic vesicles have valves, one-way valves, similar again to the veins, that make sure that the fluid is just moving one way, always back towards the cardiovascular system. So that's a little overview of the functions of the lymphatic vessels, how it's similar and different from the cardiovascular system, how it interrelates with the cardiovascular system. Let's move on now and take a look at this picture here, which shows the setup of the lymphatic system around. The lymphatic system is interesting in that it's not equally spread around the body. Maybe that's kind of a weird way to say that, but as you look at this person here, you can see that there's two main systems, two main lymphatic pathways that the fluid can follow to get back to the cardiovascular system, and they're not equally separated across the body. First of all, we have what's called the lymphatic duct, and that's found on this side of the body here. This is this kind of light green, pea green color that's on this person here. All the area that's shaded on this side is drained by the lymphatic duct. The other parts, everything else, which as you can see is much larger, so both legs fit into this part, and then one of the arms, half the head, so half the body, and then the whole bottom half the body. These are all drained by what's called the thoracic duct. So you can see here where the lymphatic duct enters the cardiovascular system. And these ducts both come into the subclavian veins. So as the lymphatic system is bringing this fluid back and dumping it back into the cardiovascular system, this is where it enters, in these subclavian veins. So we have the subclavian vein on the right side, and we have the subclavian vein on the left side. The thoracic duct, which empties this whole part of the body, is all dumping back into the left subclavian vein. And so this is kind of interesting how this is set up. I'm not sure why it's set up. I don't really have any explanation why it would evolve this way, but this is how it is. And the lymphatic system, though, so what this means, though, is that if the thoracic duct gets clogged, or the movement in the lymphatic lymph stops in the thoracic side, then that's going to affect different parts of the body than if the lymphatic duct is clogged. And just like the cardiovascular system has different vessels, the lymphatic vessel does as well. We have the lymph capillaries, which we've already seen, that are interconnected with the capillaries of the cardiovascular system. These dump into what are called the lymphatic collecting vessels, and they take the lymph away from the lymph capillaries, and they also travel through. You can see on this picture here we have these little spots, these kind of little nodes here, which are called lymph nodes. And the collecting vessels carry the lymph away from the lymphatic capillaries through these lymph nodes, and then return it back into the cardiovascular system. These lymph nodes are scattered around the body, and the lymph nodes are very important in the immune system and the cleaning out of the lymphatic system. You can see that there's a few places that these are really concentrated, and we have what are the inguinal nodes here. So in our inguinal part of our body, we have the inguinal nodes, very concentrated. We have the axillary nodes, so under your armpit, and then we also have the cervical nodes here in your neck. And these lymph nodes, these are what will swell up. So say you have a bacterial infection, your lymph nodes may swell. They become very tender and swollen. And they're related to this lymphatic system, and the reason that's happening, the reason they're swelling, is that means your body's actively fighting the infection that is trying to take over your body. So even though it may be painful and they get all swollen, that is a good thing. That means that your lymphatic system is working correctly. So let's take the last little part of this section of the lecture and look at the lymph nodes specifically. So these lymph nodes are about the shape, but they look like a little bean, and that's about the size. So they do vary in shape, but usually they're less than 1 inch long in kind of this bean shape that we see here. Surrounded by connective tissue, so they have this connective tissue capsule around, and then we have, moving inside this capsule, we have these trabeculae. Trabecula is the singular. So we have trabeculae, which are these little divisions. They're almost like little walls that come off of the connective tissue outside and form these little chambers within the lymph node. We have some different areas in the lymph node. We have what's called the cortex, and then we also have these follicles that we see in the lymph node. On one side of the lymph node, we have the afferent vessels, and these are the vessels that are bringing the lymph into the lymph node. On the opposite side, we have the efferent vessels that are taking the fluid out and then continuing to head towards the cardiovascular system. Notice a couple things here. First of all, you can see these valves, these one-way valves on the lymph vesicles. So you can see that they're only moving in one direction, the lymph vessels. So the fluid can only move in one direction. And notice that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 on this picture. There's 4 afferent vessels coming in, and there's only 2 efferent vessels going out. What this means is that the flow coming in is going to get caught up here in the lymph node. And that is purposely done so that as the lymph is coming through, the immune system will have time to sort through all the fluid coming through before it sends it back out through the efferent lymphatic vessels. And then also notice that these trabeculae form kind of a maze almost. So as the fluid is coming in, it doesn't have a direct line to the efferent vessels, so it has to kind of meander around through these different areas before it's able finally to make it out of the out through the efferent vessels. And this is all, again, a time mechanism here that is slowing the fluid down and allowing time for the cells within the lymph node to look at the fluid that's coming through and sort through, clean it, make sure that everything's happening and nothing's getting through that we don't want. There's a couple types of important cells that live in these lymph nodes. One is called a macrophage. In the last lecture on cardiovascular system, we talked about macrophages. Macrophages are white blood cells, and their job is to engulf. So they engulf through phagocytosis. They basically eat bacteria, dead cells. I mean, they'll eat foreign substances to remove them from our body. And they do that very well. And they have a very large appetite, and so they'll eat and eat and eat. The other type of cell we have is what's called a lymphocyte. And we'll talk more about both of these types of cells a little later in this series of lectures on the lymphatic system. But these guys, the lymphocytes, are also white blood cells, and they're very important in their immune response. One of the things they do, one type of lymphocyte produces antibodies that attach to and attack foreign bacteria, viruses, and then also there's other lymphocytes that will find and kill these foreign cells and things like that. So these are all very important cells that we have inside our lymph node. The lymphocytes are going to be found inside the cortex here. And specifically within these follicles, so we have these little areas called follicles within the cortex, and those are going to house the lymphocytes that are going to be used in the immune response. So that we have the cortex with the follicles, and then in the middle of the lymph node, we have the medulla. And you can see here it says the medullary sinus, the medullary cord. So in here is our medulla section of the lymph node, and that is where the macrophages are going to be hanging out, is in the medulla. So the lymphocytes in the cortex, the macrophages within the medulla, and they're all, again, they're cleaning out and making sure everything's happening how it's supposed to. So that's a little bit about the lymph nodes and how they function in our immune response and how they relate to the lymphatic vessels. So that's a little introduction to the lymphatic system. In the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about the different organs of the lymphatic system, and then we'll talk about more in depth about the immune system and the immune response.